Hello and welcome. You found the Social Work Podcast. My name's Jonathan Singer, and I'll be your host as we explore all things social work. Hey there, podcast listeners. Jonathan here. Today's episode is a very short but important interview with Dr. Tia Dole, who is the Chief 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline Officer at Vibrant Emotional Health. And the reason why we're doing this is because I have the honor and privilege of serving on the 988 National Steering Committee, which is one of several committees that 988 has put together with SAMHSA. Today is September 18th. We had a steering committee meeting today in New York, and Tia was very kind enough during our lunch hour to do a quick interview with me for the podcast. One of the reasons why I wanted to do it is because yesterday, September 17th, T-Mobile and Verizon, two of the three largest mobile phone providers in the United States, switched over to geo-routing for phone calls. Now, this is not geolocation, and Tia will explain why that is in the episode. Now, we also talk about services for Spanish-speaking users, deaf and hard of hearing, and some thoughts about the future of 988. I met Tia several years ago when she was the Chief Clinical Operations Officer at the Trevor Project, which is the world's largest suicide prevention and crisis intervention organization for LGBTQ youth. In between that and heading up 988, she was the executive director of the Steve Fund. So without further ado, on to episode 139 of the Social Work Podcast, an update of the 988 Suicide and Crisis Lifeline, an interview with Tia Dole. So Tia, thank you so much for being here on the podcast and talking with us today about 988.
Well, thank you for having me.
So what are some of the big wins for 988 recently?
So I will say my favorite thing is beyond serving 10 million people and 10 million contacts really in less than 2 years. My favorite win of the last year has been Videophone, which is serving folks who are deaf and hard of hearing via ASL. That is something that is incredibly meaningful to me, and I know that the deaf and hard of hearing community are incredibly excited about it.
And there's also services in Spanish as well as English, right?
Yes, last summer we launched Spanish services in chat and text for the first time. Prior, we were just answering calls in voice. And it's interesting because going along with folks answering calls and chats and texts is also training people. So we have a crisis center, for instance, in Puerto Rico that is monolingual Spanish. And so we now offer trainings in Spanish for them.
That's amazing. So what are some of the other wins that 988 has?
Well, this week on September 17th, we launched geo-routing. Previously, folks were routed to 988 via their area code. So I live in New York City, I have a 646 area code, but what if I moved to California? I was still being routed back to my call center here in New York City. And so with geo-routing, we now route people based on their general location. And just for folks to know, it is not geolocation. We are not pinpointing individuals. What we're doing is routing their call based on the local call towers, and then they're going to the local call center. And the reason why that's important is that the call center knows local resources. If I live in New York City, I call in New York City, they're going to know which CPEP is open, or they're going to know which crisis continuum resource they should be offered.
Well, I think that's a really important distinction, geolocation and geo-routing. I know there's a lot of criticism of 988 from people who say, well, if you call 988, they're going to send somebody out to your house and something bad will happen. So how is geo-routing with somebody's location like not the same as like, we now know where you are and we're going to come get you?
The difference is we don't know where they are. It's simply routed through our systems. So we may know that they're in New York City, and so they're going to get routed to that local call center. But I actually want to go back to what you said, which is if you call 988 and you're in the middle of a suicidal crisis and you need emergency services, we will dispatch hopefully not police, but hopefully more mobile crisis to an individual's homes. That is absolutely a possibility, and people need to know that before they call 988. I'll add on is that that's actually a relatively rare occurrence. We engage emergency services in about 2% of our calls. So that means 98% of people who reach out to us don't require an additional emergency service, that they're actually able to de-escalate during the course of the call, and then we provide them with referrals.
That's really interesting. So like if you think about the 10 million contacts, 98% of those, whatever
that number is.
Yeah, whatever the number, the issue was resolved during that contact or maybe in a subsequent contact, but there was no dispatch. There was nobody sent out. But in 2% of the cases, there were.
Yes, and not all of those are non-consensual. Our ideal scenario in that is that we say, hey, you know what, can we stay on the line while we call emergency services? We can call together. We can tell them what's going on. We want folks to self-select into that, or we'll even stay on the phone with them while they walk themselves to an emergency room. And so it's not always non-consensual. We want people to be on board with the next step.
So I think it's really important for folks to know that 988 isn't like, a 15,000 person large call center, but it routes calls to like over 200 crisis centers, right, that are local. What are some of the things that 988 as an organizing structure is doing to get voices of different people into the decision-making process? What does that look like?
Oh, gosh. Well, we have a lot of committees. So we have steering committee, we have lived experience committee. We also have advisory committees that are a little bit less formal. For instance, we have our LGBTQ youth advisory committee saying, like, what are some policies and procedures that we need to do to serve young people who have that identity. So we speak a lot to people in the community who have an opinion. It matters. And we actually have a lot of conversations with states, with crisis centers. 988 doesn't belong to an individual, right? I consider myself to be the caretaker of it for now, but it belongs to the people who live in this country regardless of their identity, and that we have to talk to those people to make sure that we're serving them the way that they want so that any person can receive the same type and level of service, but it is different based on who they are. One of the things I think about is embedding 988 into the cultural zeitgeist, right? So, children learn in elementary and middle school stop, drop, and roll. I want children to know about 988 starting as a young person, just like they learn about 911. And so to me, it really is making sure that folks know that we're here and what we're here for and how that distinguishes from 911.
That's great. Well, Tia, thank you so much for taking a minute and talking with us about 988. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much for having me.
I'm Jonathan Singer, and thanks for being with me today for another episode of the Social Work Podcast. If you missed an episode or have suggestions for future episodes, please visit socialworkpodcast.com. If you'd like to support the podcast, please visit our online store at cafepress.com/swpodcast. To all the social workers out there, keep up the good work. We'll see you next time at the Social Work Podcast.